Okay, we're live, and I'm going to jump in and answer the question in 1 minute. Uh, are we slaves of Jews? And my friend here, Claire, will jump in straight after that, and then we'll do introductions because you might not want to care. You might not care who we are and stuff like that more than our answers. So anyway, so my brief answer is just looking at who's calling the shots, who gets special treatment, and stuff like that. Evening, Jay. Um, it seems either Jews or some other materialistic power runs the world. Okay, and that's just looking at the evidence. Who's running things at the moment? Who's running newspapers and stuff like that, right? But for me, this might ruin it for people, but I'll just tell you up front. It kind of doesn't matter exactly who is running the world. It matters mostly for me because I'm concerned with like what can I do, what can we do. All my streams are about not blaming and finger pointing, but thumb pointing. Like, what do we do wrong? And the answer to me is like, okay, how are we being enslaved in the first place? And it's mainly not by the gun. It's mainly through our greed, not force. Okay, and so maybe we need to look at how we're being enslaved and to what extent we're being enslaved. And really, my quick answer is you can be free straight away. And our general enslavement and general weakness of the good people is because we're not good enough. We're easily too tempted as a world population, and that's why a few people seem to control a lot of people because we're terrible. Is the short answer. Claire, what's your opinion in short?
Are we the slave to Jews? I think people who are obsessed about Jews are, well, they usually don't think that well of them, and they tend to be anti-Semites, and I'm on this kind of idolatry theory thing, and I'm saying that a lot of atheists are the slaves to their own appetites, and therefore anti-Semites are the slaves to their anti-Semitism.
Okay.
And because they hate Jews so much and have hated them for so long, they will always interpret everything to be, oh, it's those Jews again. Getting to the front of the queue before us, jumping the queue, etc. And, without necessarily diagnosing the problem. They just think, we've never liked them, we're just going to blame them for everything, because what else are they for? That kind of attitude.
That's your bit, yeah? Cool.
Yes.
So now we'll do our introductions and we'll go into depth and discuss each of our ideas. So I'm a Muslim. I do happiness classes for non-Muslims, as well as Muslims who want to listen. But the reason why I introduced myself like that is that you don't have to be a Muslim. You don't have to accept on my ideas on belief. I do it based on logic. I'm inspired by the Islamic ideas, which I show how they work in real life, and then I prove the psychology and the science and what everybody, all the sort of, call them academics or specialists, say that prove my point. But you don't have to believe it. It's just not on faith. Is what I mean. And when I say happiness, I'm talking about personal to global happiness. That's why we're talking about this massive issue. And generally, just to give you a better idea of what's happening in this show, is that I do a happiness course, and this week's one is supposed to be about our relationship to government. How can we get better leaders and all this kind of stuff? But considering what's happening at the moment, we can see obviously thousands of Palestinians being killed and 1,000 or so Jews are being killed and things like that. And with all the special treatment that Israel is getting, breaking all these humanitarian laws and stuff like that, you kind of go, you know what? Even if we manage to get our government together, it seemed to be in the hands of somebody else, and maybe it's the Jews or something like that. So maybe this was the elephant in the room that was worth being answered. So that's my little background. Claire, what do you want to say about yourself? What's your intro?
Well, I'm an unusual agnostic in that I am promoting Sharia as an agnostic because I think the reason why these Westerners feel lower in status to Jews as well as Muslims is because they haven't got a proper religion, and because they haven't got a proper religion they have no protection from their corrupt and incompetent ruling classes or their criminal classes, and everything is going wrong for them. And I think just having an official moral system would help them enormously, but they are too much the slaves of their Islamophobia as well as their anti-Semitism to maybe consider the fact that Christianity and liberalism have failed, and their pride won't allow them to admit that. And that is the psychological difficulty that I hope I can maybe help them by being their therapist. Although I know they hate me just for saying that.
I was thinking a similar thing, not just you, but both of us, right? Because what we're doing straight off the bat is really unpopular. Instead of blaming everybody else, and I definitely don't agree the killing of thousands of children, like just because I'm blaming ourselves generally, I'm not supporting genocide. People kind of conflate the two too easily because the habit in the world at the moment is to blame and point fingers, right? And so it's like, what responsibility do we take? Because if you can't take responsibility, there's no hope. I think that makes sense, right? If you don't think, what could I have done or what have I done wrong that I could do right, then there's no hope. It's like, oh, we're just victims. We're just victims of this superpower, this invisible superpower. I'm not saying it's not there, but being a victim is not a solution, It's like, it shouldn't happen, and then it will stop happening. We'll protest for 1 or 2 days and it will stop happening. And you know what? Maybe something is happening with the protest. I don't know. And I think there are some things we're doing right as well. I'll probably point those out as well. So that's kind of where we're probably being unpopular, but I hope there's actually more hope in pointing out our own faults. What do you think about that? Do you think, I don't know, what do you think about it? Do you think we're going to be really unpopular for pointing out that we probably might have done something wrong and we're weak and it's not just our overlords' fault? When I say overlords, the famous phrase for the secret leaders or something.
Yes, some conspiracy. I'm saying, as earlier I was saying, we need an official moral system with a list of rules to tell us, who we are and, what we're supposed to be doing. And when we do, we will be able to hold our ruling classes to account. But because we don't, we allow our ruling classes to make up the rules as they go along, and our beliefs have changed over the decades. And on the question of Jews, I suppose, because they are identified, because they call themselves God's chosen people, they will instinctively allow envy. They will provoke envy. It's like, well, who made you the boss? Why should you? You're no better than us.
So people will be shouting out if they're watching this video with anger, right? So I might as well interrupt quickly. It's not really envy, do you think? They just don't like Jews killing other people. It's not really envy. So what would your response be? It's not anti-Semitism even. It's not like people hate Jews. There are good Jews, bad Jews, all sorts of kind of people. It's just like they don't like the Jews that call themselves Zionists, and Zionism means they own this land that they lived on, or some was part of, for some historical reason 3,000 years ago they claimed to that particular land called Jerusalem, etc. Like, it's not being envious. It's just like, stop killing people. What would you be?
I was actually thinking in more general terms before the Hamas incursion. I was thinking of how much, but this is not the first time that Jews and Arabs fought each other. and there have been, previous events, and I guess I'm just, putting them on under the, the general heading of why are Jews in Israel protected by the American Empire?
Sure.
And this is obviously resented by Muslims who live in the Middle East, and therefore the Ummah
The
in
whole world resents that.
yes. So and I think it's really quite simple. The Jews have been made the mascots of the American Empire, and if we understand the principle of mascot, we will know that it's like a kind of doll or an effigy that is supposed to represent something, and the people who want to support that idea kind of rally behind. It's like a standard, or like the team colours of your gang or something, or your football team.
Okay, so let's dig into that. So who's controlling who? Is it the Jews in charge? Are the Jews being used? Oh, we've got David, who is a rabbi friend. Thank you so much for coming in short notice. Thank you very much for being here. Shalom.
Yeah, my pleasure. I just got back from work. I'm heating up something to eat real quick, but I saw you said you're streaming for an hour, so I thought I'd pop on right away.
Oh, brilliant. If you need to grab a cup of coffee or something to get comfortable, that's good.
I've forgotten I've forgotten what I was going to say now.
Okay.
We're talking about why the U.S. backs Israel, or the
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, David. And I'm saying that Jews have been made the mascot of the American Empire, maybe without their permission, and there is a downside when the American Empire is becoming increasingly unpopular to its subject peoples as well as its own people. And that is the cause of anti-Semitism, when everybody resents you for, bombing and invading oil-rich Muslim countries, and your own people don't want the endless wars, and they see Jews as being the ones given special privileges, and envy is really almost synonymous with hatred. You hate somebody you envy. You don't think they should have the thing that you want, and there seems to be no reason for them having it. But I don't think a lot of people understand that the post-war narrative is that the British sacrificed the empire to save the Jews from the Nazis, and having sacrificed its empire, the burden of protecting Jews passed to America.
That's a really... Okay, never heard of that one before. So the British Empire sacrificed its empire to protect Jews. I've never heard... What do you mean? Is that what you said?
Yes, that was what I said. I mean, Britain declared 2 world wars against Germany, and it was really an imperial war. Britain saw Germany rising as an imperial power and wanted to keep it down. It's a phenomenon called the Thucydides trap, when an established empire, wants to destroy a rising empire to see that it is never rivaled. And so both world wars was Britain declaring a war on Germany, and the consequence was that Britain lost its empire. The Europeans lost their empire, and all their empire basically passed over to America, and that explains why Europe is now an occupied country whose leaders basically follow the orders of Uncle Sam.
No, okay, I see. I'm not jumping into... I'm letting our rabbi here, David, have a mouthful before I ask him. Obviously, his opinion is very important. But okay, let me just touch on a few things you said. So you said the British Empire was sacrificed for the Jews.
The narrative was that.
Oh, it
you
was
know,
the narrative, not the
the
reality.
narrative, because obviously, it's sort of like, oh, we tried to stamp on Germany because it was a rising power, and we
Okay,
lost
yeah.
our empire in the process, and they wanted to flip it over and say, oh, oh, we never should have had empire, and it's gone now, but we sacrificed it to save the Jews from the horrible Nazis. And this is the narrative that the British Empire, that the British government wants to propagate, and then the Americans say, yeah, and now we are taking over your burden of protecting the Jews.
Okay, cool. So, David, what's your picture here? What's happening in the world? Are Jews anything to do with it? Are we enslaved to the Jews, or are we enslaved to something else? Are we to blame in any way? Those are the kind of questions I'm interested in.
Well, I mean, preferably a person should voluntarily enslave themselves to God. Um, the book, The Duties of the Heart, makes the if you put yourself at the mercy of the lower force, whatever that is, so to say, God will remove Himself and leave you to that lower force. So if you
Mm,
directly and voluntarily enslave yourself to the one true God, then you could directly serve God. If you don't, even as atheistic or whatever it is, money, passion, um, power, uh, God will remove Himself and leave you to that lower force, in implying that all lower forces in reality are directly controlled by God, anyways. Um, but with, the theological basis, relating to what Claire says, um, from a biblical point of view and a conspiratorial point of view, there's a connection between Jews and empire. From the biblical point of view, you always had one dominant global empire, and that empire is where the Jews, majority of the Jews, reside. From like Egypt to Assyria, uh, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, um, the Iraq, uh, Islam, rise of Islam through Spain, through Northern Europe, Amsterdam, uh, the Netherlands, France, the UK, and now America.
wow.
There's a connection between the empire is who controls the land of Israel and where the majority of the Jews reside. That's from a biblical perspective, like the prophecies of Daniel, going through today. Uh, if you're talking, just the UK never had a unipolar empire. Like today, maybe for a small period of time, the U.S. was such a dominant empire. You could call it was like a unipolar world, as they say, moving to a multipolar world. The British never dominated as they were maybe the biggest empire, but they were never um, the world power in the sense where they dominated all other powers, like the mainland. They waged war, had a few wars in like France or various, but the UK never dominated mainland Europe, and most of its power was by sea, and even globally there were always competitors. But in the element, okay, like World War I and World War II, the UK as an empire that had become intertwined with the Jews, at that point, largely seen through the creation of the markets first being created in like the Dutch East India Company, the London Insurance Exchange, through the stock exchange, the joint stock companies, uh, that the UK was intertwined with the Jews as like a merchant class, the management class, and to some extent, due to that, chose to wage war with Germany, and that weakened their power. And when the UK lost their grip of India, that was the beginning. I mean, obviously the UK lost the American Revolution to the colonies in the US, but World War II, that was basically the end of the British Empire after losing India, then losing Israel, and I'm not sure you could directly correlate it to it was just the Jews, like you say, it was natural. There were other influence that were causing the British Empire on decline, and that included mostly letting go of India, which was their main profit center for global trade. And then after the war, uh, you had a small multipolar world where you had the rise of Russia and the US. And then after the Cold War, the US emerges as the main superpower. That's the Jewish center. Jews are like a merchant intellectual class, not necessarily running America, but being very influential in America in financial, intellectual, management class. And the U.S. as an empire and the one that's the protector of the Jews, the protector of the land in Israel goes hand in hand. And now, with the decline of the United States, there's also the question: well, can the U.S. protect the Jews? Can the U.S. Um, protect the land of Israel?
So I'm trying to get this short, like, so I wanted to hear like your short version because I did a short version of what my thesis was. Claire did one, and then we introduced ourselves. I was trying to get like so people like catch on right from the beginning of the live stream. What is it that where we're claiming, then we'll slowly support it. You've given some really interesting ideas I've never considered. Like it seems like you're saying like there seems to be a pattern at least. Why the pattern? And the pattern is that Jews seem to be at the heart of every empire, except for the British Empire, because for some reason they weren't a proper empire. We could talk about what that is. I don't know if I'm summarizing correctly. Is that roughly what you're saying? That there seems to be some correlation between Jews being at the heart of every
Yeah, that's the
empire?
biblical point of view, like the prophecies of Daniel, that the
Oh,
Kabbalists extend to the modern time. That you would say, okay, the biblical, like we were talking yesterday, the biblical stories are about the past, the present, and the future simultaneously. So, just like Egypt, and as a population center, so you could say that the majority of the Jews, there was a connection between Jews and the British Empire, but the Jews were mainly centered in Europe, in Eastern Europe, Germany, and the Europe was the global leader. They're saying Britain
okay.
wasn't
So
wasn't
I
the
will
only.
dig into that in a bit. But could you say something about yourself, David? So are you a rabbi like I've described you? Would you describe yourself as that?
You could call me rabbi. I'm saying I'm an independent scholar, so I don't have any official position. I'm not a leader of a synagogue or a Jewish organization, but just in terms like rabbi meaning Jewish scholar, I studied in Jerusalem and under leading rabbis. So just in the simplest term of rabbi is like a teacher or Jewish scholar. That's fine, but not like a official position.
Okay, cool. And maybe just some more nuanced details. Besides being a Jew, you seem to be very open-minded. Some people, Claire calls you a Hindu, which means maybe it sounds funny, but it means like somebody who accepts a lot of the tenets of Hinduism. This morning, for me, it was this morning. I think it was yesterday for you when we talked last. You said you would even call yourself a Muslim, but you might not necessarily accept Prophet Muhammad as a prophet, but you might accept a lot of the tenets. So, is that kind of something? Is that a reasonable thing I've said about you? Just to give a
I'm a
clearer idea.
universalist in the sense like, well, yeah, I submit to God. So if you want to call me a Muslim, like I'll take that as a compliment because you're like I'm a voluntarily enslaved myself to God. I fully
Yeah,
submit
because
to God.
Islam means to submit
Um,
yourself. Yeah.
if you meet the tenet, like, do I accept Muhammad as God's messenger? I might have to remain neutral on that. You say like, well, in that way, maybe I'm not a Muslim, or do I accept the Quran as divinely inspired? Even if you press me on that, I might be like, well, I'm not really a Muslim. Um, a lot
It's
of
enough
times,
to say you're very open-minded to even even to be neutral on it from a Jewish point of view is very open-minded, is what I was getting at. So,
yeah, a lot of
yeah,
these discussions, I'm speaking as an independent Jewish scholar. So like, who am I? My personal interests, my personal beliefs are could be irrelevant to the conversation. Doesn't matter what I believe. It doesn't
sure.
matter what my personal proclivities. But like, yeah, I mean, personally, I'm a civil engineer. I studied in Jerusalem and in Brooklyn and did things within the Jewish community. But I have Hindu leanings. I've also done interfaith for almost 20 years, and I started interfaith with the Muslims. So, I did interfaith somewhat on behalf of the Jewish community, not necessarily officially, although at times I was part of official Jewish groups. But I like interfaith, and I like understanding different traditions. And Hinduism appealed to me the most, specifically the Vedic philosophy, the concepts of karma, transmigration of soul, ahimsa. Uh, but all traditions interest me, and I'll call myself a universal humanist
Okay.
philosophically. But I mean, if you just want me to represent Judeo opinions, I'll simply, my opinion doesn't matter, and I'm just going to do the
Sure.
best
You,
to
you just
express
should
my
like
scholarship
people.
on the subject, minus
Yeah.
my own personal biases.
Yeah, sure. Like I'm saying I'm Muslim, but people might not accept I'm even a Muslim, for example. It's like whatever. It's like here are some perspectives from the different scriptures and faiths and stuff like that. Okay, cool. So I'm gonna just try to dig on because I try to keep my live streams really short, like 1 hour is particularly short for a lot of live streams. So dig into some of the core issues. So let's try to describe our view in a bit more depth as to who's leading the country, the world, I should say, our theories and what it's based on. So we'll go around in a circle, and then the thing I'm really interested in afterwards is how do you escape enslavement, whoever we're enslaved to. Already, I'm like in massive agreement with David about we should voluntarily enslave ourselves to God. You know what? Before I forget that, I'm going to ask you a question because Claire said something last time, and she said what I said based on the Quran is actually based in the Bible. She gave me a reference, and I still didn't even check it. It was like the Quran gives an example. It says if you have you seen the example of a person who's slave to one master versus to a slave person who's slave to many masters pulling in different directions?
Yeah, I'm familiar with
Uh,
that one.
right. So is that's from the Quran? But I think there's something similar that Claire mentioned from the Bible. Have you heard of anything like
Yes,
that?
it's in the New Testament. A man cannot serve two masters. I
Right.
suppose it just means that you can't serve God and your own base appetites or your desire for material goods or whatever it is that you're hooked on.
There's a
Sure.
rabbinic statement that puts like a nice pithy in the section called Ethics of the Father that just has a bunch of nice statements. And one of them is the only way to be free is to voluntarily enslave yourself. Here it doesn't use to God, it uses to the law. But you generally be accepted as God. So freedom is only achieved by recognizing this theological clarity that there is a God. I have obligation to serve, recognize, love, fear my true master, and only within that recognition can true freedom be achieved. And in the same pithy statement there includes that if you don't do that, then you're actually going to be enslaved to lower forces. So the only way to become free is to voluntarily enslave yourself to God. And from interfaith and talking with Muslims, most Muslims fully agree. Depending on how it's phrased, Hindus or Christians, almost any um, person who believes in a higher power might accept the wisdom or the truth of that statement. And so you'll say,
Yeah.
well, who's in charge? Like God is in charge. Like the Jewish people might have a special role, but that's the Jewish people do not have a unique power from God. In the if the Jewish people have any power, that is exclusively from from God, not from ourselves.
Okay, yeah. So actually, I that's actually the key to what I want to talk about. I want to talk about how we can find freedom, but I did want to point out that a lot of people see themselves as victims, um, and so I wanted to look at okay, sure, let's spend a little bit of time on who is controlling us and maybe how they're controlling us because I think there is an idea that there seems to be some sort of domineering power in the background, whoever they may be, Jews or somebody else. Let's get that out the way. But then the crux of what I think is really valuable is you know let me quickly respond to that. So, what is valuable is to how to escape all this control. So yeah, quick answer, and I do like to explain very briefly. This is my garden. I live in a village in Jordan, next to where all the trouble was happening in Israel, and yeah, I love this place. It's got olive trees on that side, and in the background, and grapevines, and all sorts of stuff. And the rest is kind of a desert, and there's lots of sheep and Bedouin people living around as well, which is all very interesting. So that's the quick explanation of that. Okay, so let's start off with rewind to who are you. So David gave an idea that there seems to be different empires, but let's talk about today. Who's controlling today? Is it just America? But people would question, like, all the different presidents, they all seem to have the same foreign policy of bomb all the Muslim countries, steal the oil, and never mind just the Muslim countries, everything, right? South America, steal their oil, destroy everything, maybe that's an unfair description. You don't have to stick or agree with that. So Claire, what do you actually? Yeah, Claire. What would you? Who is? Do you think there's a group of people controlling everything, and maybe how or something like that?
Well, the neocons control American
Are you
foreign
saying neocons because you don't want to say Zionist? Because you can say Zionist here.
Well, neocons would be Zionists, but it would just be quicker to say that the Americans have a global empire, they control the world, they are evil, but that's because America doesn't have an official moral system, because they obviously don't think that they need to follow any system at all. They can keep making up the rules as they go along. That's been their way since the inception of the American Empire. And the role of Jews here is that, there is such a thing called the Noahide laws, and Jews, in my view, are supposed to rank the four Gentile religions according to their conformity with the Noahide laws, producing the ranking that Islam is the most Noahide and Christianity the least. And Jews refuse to do that, and could be said to be indirectly responsible for the evil of the Western imperialists.
So
and even now, they won't do it.
Okay, so what you're saying is that people who don't have rules to live by, that would be the modern West, they are going to be susceptible to control because they're going to be very weak. And there's a lot of reality behind that. You can see Western society collapsing in so many ways, from marriage to criminality, everything, the whole lot, right? So I can see that. And maybe the people who do have rules, maybe the Jews, maybe the Muslims, they're going to be more powerful just by default. And then they're going to take advantage of any weakness. And maybe that's sensible. Rather than having a collapsed society left to its own devices, why not do something with it, right? And that might sound evil because a lot of the people who are doing the controlling are doing very evil things, like killing off people, destroying other people's economies, and stuff like that. So have I summarized correctly what you're saying? People who don't have rules deserve to be ruled.
Well, I mean, there's a saying that the sin is its own punishment. So if you're told not to do something and you persist in doing it, then you will have to suffer the consequences of your idolatry and your lawlessness and your breaking of the Noahide laws. And it begins with breaking the first two, which is the prohibitions against idolatry and blasphemy. And that's the role of Jews to teach to Gentiles, like, well, you mustn't do it because, whatever. And I'm saying you suffer the opportunity cost of not being rightly guided by the Quran if you want to make up your own rules.
To clarify, your understanding of, or when you say idolatry, you don't mean necessarily praying to a piece of wood. You mean sort of materialism, idolizing people and things, whatever, rather than God. Is that what you're saying when you say
Well, yeah,
idolatry?
or worshipping Jesus as the co-equal of God, which is what the doctrine of the Trinity requires Christians to do. I know most of them don't believe in it and don't even know they're supposed to believe in it, but in the olden days of absolute monarchy, all the subjects of these European kingdoms had to obey, to follow the religion of their king, and if they didn't, they would be burnt at the stake if they questioned the Trinity. And
Sure.
I think that was what caused the rebellion in America, because obviously
But
intelligent
we want to stick
men
on just the main
don't
topic.
want to do it anymore.
Sure.
But they were
So,
left with so because the founding fathers separated the church from their state, they didn't you know give America a religion. So basically, Congress has been making up the rules as they go along, as has the British Parliament, as does the Knesset in
so
Israel, that
basically,
runs
so
under the
basically,
same system.
sure. So basically, what you're saying is, like I was saying before, but you're backing it up further, is that a godless society is going to be weak, it's going to crumble, and people who are God centered, I suppose, are going to be more powerful and take advantage of it. And you can see Muslims taking over things, and maybe you can see also Jews. They certainly seem to have a lot of power. So you're saying that's the root cause, and one of the many problems in the past is that what Westerners think is a good thing, which is to separate church or religion from state, you're saying is a bad thing because the state is just random, made up, man-made rules that kind of go with the times, which is not necessarily a good thing. You're saying, no, I'd agree, and I would agree very brief because I want to get. Sorry, I keep interrupting. I would agree very quickly in that I do believe the righteous will inherit the earth. That's something both in the Quran and the Torah, as far as I understand. And I think that's, I don't want to say it's a self-evident truth that the righteous will inherit the earth, but if you describe righteousness as good long-term thinking rather than selfish thinking, let's say, selfish thinking is usually short-term thinking, then good long-term healthy thinking like having families, justice and all this kind of stuff, that's going to work for the long term. I don't want to interrupt you too much. Claire, do you want to say something briefly, but like really fixate as much as you can on this idea of who's ruling us and why, if you want to add any more to what you've already said.
Oh, you were talking about marriage and family, and I think only religious people see the point in getting married before having children and staying together for the sake of the children. It's these atheists who think, oh, well, I don't fancy having children, I'll be single, I'll be gay, I'll be transgender, and these attitudes interfere with their ability to produce and parent the next generation. And what children they manage to have, they don't bother with them much. They don't educate them or parent them particularly well, and then they lose out to the immigrants or foreigners, and hate them and envy the Jews and the Muslims who have been elevated to a status above them, and that is what causes anti-Semitism and Islamophobia.
Okay, so let's get into this very fundamental question, I suppose. If we assume America is controlling the world, David, who's controlling America?
Yeah, I would say any other answer than God is heretical, that there is no power other than God. It is heretical to think that anything other than God could have power over you. And so if you're looking, well, there are rules. So like there's the rules of nature, like gravity or energy conservation, the various things like these rules have power over us. You can't you break the rule of gravity or the scientific rule, and it also would apply to karma, reward, and punishment. So you're the Kabbalist, you're lending on like the Hindu terminology. There's the question of high or low birth, in the sense where um, there's people who administer rules, but the rules are somewhat independent of actual people. So if you take low birth, you have very little connection to the rules. There's just these
Did you say
rules.
low birth?
Low birth in terms like that your soul entered your body in a particular family, place, and time. And like if you take low birth, meaning that your position in life is one of no power, like a peasant, uh, someone from a poor family, as opposed to like high birth being the king's son, meaning the people who the maker of rules, the enforcer of rules, or the subjectee of rules, or so to say the person who's struggling for resources versus the controller of resources, and much of that is related to position of birth. And so if you say, well, what is the ultimate cause of okay, rich dad, poor dad is the position of birth. And but say if rules are universal, sometimes societies have different rules. Sometimes you could be in a position where you might have more leeway to get away with not following rules. There's
So
financial.
I'm not exactly sure if I'm 100% following, because maybe I'm not following all the terms you're using or something like that. So if you were trying to summarize what your answer is, I don't want you to keep summarizing. Maybe it's really unfair, but what are you saying in terms of who controls America? If we assume, okay. So first of all, your starting point was it's wrong to say anybody but God controls the earth. But then again, God gives, what's the freedom of choice and all this kind of, I can't remember what the word is,
Dominion.
right? Yeah, right. So given that we've got this space to be good and bad, and there are people who's on the face of it seem to be controlling things because there seems to be a pattern, who would you describe within God's control, let's put it that way, is controlling the world?
Well, that's why I said like anything other than there is no controller, there is no power other than God. So say any answer than other than that would say is basically heretical. That Jews do not have power, the elite do not have power. They might have a temporary status of an administrator,
Yes,
but the
I
power
agree that
the
I agree,
power
the
never actually
temporary
resides.
leaders. Yes, I totally agree, because like I said, the I would say the righteous will inherit the earth and stuff like that. That's kind of what will eventually happen, and these people lose power. But who are these people who have the temporary control that God has allowed? Let's put it that way.
Well, that comes to free will and high or low birth. So you have to divide the types of power or control. So if there's, which is basically another, you understand as rules, that there's rules we all have to live according to, and if we don't, we're either rewarded or punished based on um, following these rules. And it might, many of these rules are going to be administered by man. So if you're talking about financial rules, so if you take low birth and you have no possessions versus taking high birth. So if you talk like financial rules, there's corporations, there's stockholders, there's uh, A class shares, there's banks, there's so to say elites in within the military, within law, and every field that however you're going to divide it, education, economics, law, uh, military, there's going to be elites that are connected to the making and administering of rules. And within that elite class, you're going to see that a large portion of the elite within that class are there largely due to position of birth. And so if you're looking, well, okay, what are the rules that I have to abide to? And so if you're in the rules, some of them are universal, some of them are based on position. I mean, so like if you're poor and you don't own property, you don't have to worry about the properties of ownership. You might just have to rent, or you'll follow the rules of paying rent or being a tenant, as opposed to a landlord. There's going to be a
So
different.
you're saying that people have gained power through birth?
Well, you could gain power within a single lifetime, but the majority of power is accumulated over lifetime. So when you start
Yes.
looking
Okay.
into power, and if you say, well, like the Jews, so you say, well, Jews' status of birth, but like if you look like the elite, the controllers, if you look at, well, financially, like real estate, like, I don't know, do you own or do you pay rent? I don't know the laws in Jordan, but you
Hmm.
just, well, are you an owner or are you a rent payer?
I'm living for free at the moment in my parents-in-law's house, but they paid. They own. Yeah.
Right? I mean, so they're owners, and whatever the situation. Well, how did they come to own? And is it okay? Maybe they took low birth and had to work and accumulate wealth and eventually become property owners, or maybe they took higher birth and they were born with property and their parents had property and they inherited the property.
Yeah.
But you
So
say, oh,
people learn, they earn through, you might call it meritocracy, and then they sustain it through generations.
well, there's rules that so there's the, so to say, power. I mean, say if you're landed versus if you're not landed, that's a huge power differential. So you say, well, I'm ruled by the people who are landed because I need a place to dwell, and I'm not a landowner, so I have to be ruled by my landlord, by the tenants. But everybody is ruled. So it's
Sure.
okay. Like your in-laws own property, it does not mean that they rule, and they have. In fact, they have probably more rules than the tenant has. Actually, the owner of the property actually follows many more rules than the tenant of the property. And so there is no way to escape rules. And the origin of the rules is, I mean, you could argue a little bit. I mean, say that people make rules. Rules are based on history. Rules are built up over a generation, and
Hmm.
rules are administered by people. And the closer you get to the administration of rules, the more power you have. But you're never actually free
Sure.
from rules.
Sure.
So,
People make up the rules to suit themselves,
no, I mean, there's no
essentially.
such thing as making up the rules to suit yourself. So,
Oh.
it would say that the higher power you have, generally, the more rules you actually obey.
Oh.
I mean, it's a misnomer to say, oh, there's people in power and they just make these rules that are subscribed to the other people, at a whim. You say that's a misnomer. It doesn't exist that way, that everybody has rules. And I would say generally, the higher you are in the power structure, actually, the more rules you have to follow than
So
the low.
is there anything in the Bible, the Torah, or any other Jewish scripture, Talmud or something, that gives you an idea, like the short version of who is in charge at any one point in time, like today at the moment? Like, is there any idea? Because in the Quran, there's a
No, it's a,
suggestion
it's a
of who's in charge.
hypothetical law. You're saying, okay, law is administered by people, but the law is objective. The law is commanded by God. The law is administered by people. You're never in charge
Oh,
of other people. And it's almost heretical to say that there's no
right.
such
Okay.
phenomenon as this person being in charge of me. And if you're looking at it that way, it's heretical because you're denying the power of God.
Sure.
You're saying there's rules that are applied to me, and maybe in certain circumstances rules could be more or less fair, and there's administrators of the rules. Like even if you're in prison and you say, well, the prison guard is just an administrator of the rules, he doesn't
Sure.
actually have power over me. The prisoner guard is just keeping rules that are enforced upon himself.
Yeah, but if the law is evil, then
Well, because God is just, so there's a temporary period where the law or rules are out of whack, it won't be sustainable. It's saying that God has the ultimate power. So, if you say, well, how could evil exist? So, you say, well, God forbid a crazy person, a maniac could kill me, God forbid torture me to death. It's like, no, only if it was ordained by God. And so, well, could there be an unfair set of rules being enforced on me? Yes, but only if it's been ordained by God.
well,
Okay.
I was saying
Okay.
earlier
Sure.
that the sin
And
is its own
just to put on
punishment.
the conclusion of that, the same
Yeah.
God that ordained my temporary situation, court ordained my temporary situation to change.
Cool. So the time is flying by really quickly. So as I said, the key thing I really wanted to focus on is how to escape enslavement, whoever these overlords are, whoever, and
So I think you
certainly
can't.
God is the
All you can
real,
do is voluntarily enslave yourself to God, but there is no
yes.
such thing as escaping enslavement.
Okay, yeah, I love that. So I'm going to very briefly, because I thought I would mention it earlier, the in the Islamic tradition, there's something called the Antichrist, actually, also in the Christian tradition, but the Islamic tradition maybe is a bit more detailed of who that is. I'm going to very briefly say Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, when he comes, if you want to save yourself from the Antichrist, and the Antichrist is not just a person, but a people, he said, read the first 10 and last 10 verses of a chapter called Surah Kahf, which is chapter 18. And basically that talks about the Christian nations. So that's the very short answer. The Christian nations are the Antichrist, which is very interesting, or weird, I suppose. The Christian nations are Antichrist, but they're not really following real Christianity, I suppose, or the real teachings of Jesus. And so we can see that that's quite apparent anyway. If we look at the surface level, there seem to be Christian nations who are actually materialistic nations who are controlling things. I think that's quite obvious. So we can disagree with that or disagree, agree, whatever, if you want. I just wanted to quickly put that out there, and I'll probably put some reference to my claims in the comment at some point, like with a document. But let's try to focus. I love this idea about, as David is explaining, and I'll be interested in what Claire thinks about how we can escape enslavement. If I can give it a really short answer, is the more you follow the laws of God, the more free you'll be. I'm going to do a sort of a macro answer. I'll be interested in what everybody else
just
thinks.
put it out there is no such thing as being free from the law or the rules. And if you say, well, if you follow the rules of God, it'll be easy to follow the temporary or structural rules of society and man, but it's a misnomer to think that there's a state of freedom from rules and laws.
Sure.
And so,
You're slave to something.
you say, well, like, I'm enslaved. I'm good at following rules. I follow God's rules voluntarily, and within following God's rules voluntarily, it's actually quite easy to navigate the rules imposed on me by man.
Right.
What about the idolatry of following Hinduism, though?
Well, I've done that voluntarily.
So you voluntarily break God's prohibition against idolatry.
We don't have to argue about that now, but that's my personal understanding of God's rule, where so to say that, I mean, there's no man-made rule that's forbidden me from doing it. And so my voluntarily following of God's law, that I've experimented with Hinduism, and I've contemplated, I've prayed to God, and I've sought understanding of God's law to say my goal and desire is not to be in violation of God's law. And like me and Khalid were talking yesterday about Freemasonic view of God giving different rules to different people at different times. That I've experimented with Hinduism, not with the intention of violating God's law, but with the intention of serving God.
So can I ask you a question, and I'll ask Claire the same question in maybe a slightly different way. So you're saying if you follow God's laws, David, you said if you follow God's laws, then it makes it easy to follow the laws of man. That's not really how I was thinking about it. I was thinking if you are closer to, it's a bit like Martin Luther King. He famously said something like, the more the laws of man are in line with the laws of God, the more there will be peace on earth. I'm sort of paraphrasing. That's more in line with what I think. The more in line we are with the laws of God, we're fine. So, for example, specifically, since you might be interested in this, David, usury or interest, that's massively destroying the earth in terms of the environment, is causing inflation and making us overmine the earth, but also is paying for wars. This is just one of the many examples of if we followed good laws of God, we wouldn't have this problem. So that's my take on it. But since Claire hasn't had much of a chance, Claire, what would be, do you agree that if you seem to agree because you're a secular Quranist, the more we follow the laws of God, the more we will be free from enslavement? Would you agree with that in any way?
I would say that the more we follow the laws of God in the Quran, the more likely we are to enjoy good, rational government, supporting marriage and family values.
And then would we be less enslaved by the current powers, whoever they are?
Well, I mean, I really think if God doesn't exist, then we are really the slaves of our government. And different governments, have different conditions in which they keep their slaves. And if the government follows God's laws, then maybe the condition then the condition of the slave would be better than if the government just made up the rules as it goes along.
Okay, and I'm going to put you, David, on the spot because this is one of the things that really confused me at Judaism. So Judaism forbids interest,
But if you don't
usually.
mind, before you ask, because
Yeah.
I'm taking issue with your word of free and saying there is no such thing as being free from the law and the rules. Freedom is from subservience to law and rules, in the sense like, okay, it's easier actually to be poor than it is to be rich in terms of rules, that you have actually made way more rules to follow if you have large bank accounts, large amounts of property, ownership of companies, um, people working for you, so on and so on.
Hmm.
You have actually many more rules that you follow. So this, sense of freedom is like a misnomer that
Very
you said,
interesting.
like duty. That I'm free in the sense that I accept my duty to follow rules, and I voluntarily follow rules, and I understand the nature of man-made rules. And so I'm taking a little issue with your sense, like, oh, I'm going to be free, and no one's going to have any rules upon me. No such
Hmm.
phenomenon. No such phenomenon.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I
And
actually
in
like
fact, the
that
better
because
life you're going to live
yeah.
will be in accordance with more and more rules. So as you become more enlightened, in better status religiously, materially, your family, a father, larger family, it will be that you're actually in accordance with more and more rules and more things that would, so to
Let
say,
me
that,
put
that,
this.
that are limiting your freedom.
Sure. Let me put it a different way. Because, yeah, I actually agree in many ways. Because one of the things I often say is if you want to be happy, it's not freedom, as we're told in the West, that's going to make you happy. It's actually responsibility, which is the opposite of freedom. It's like choosing your your own. I don't know how to put it. Like you're choosing rules to guide your power, as it were. Like rather than having it go in random directions, you're choosing rules that benefit you. So responsibility is more geared towards happiness than freedom. Like, and that's kind of known by also psychologists. I do want to bring in the fact that we're not just talking about theological ideas based on purely on our beliefs. There's psychologists like Viktor Frankl who say if you want to be happy, you have to have meaning. What does meaning mean? It means having a direction for a cause higher than yourself. That's another word for that is responsibility. What do you think about that, David? We've only got a few minutes. I know time flew, but what do you think? Like you're saying rules, there's no escape from rules, there's no such as freedom. Cool, I agree.
Yeah, I mean,
What do you
freedom's
think?
ill-defined. So, I mean, there's a lot of freedom within binding to rules, and even say, okay, well, having children, being married makes you less free in many ways, or maybe like having money, okay, you might be more free to spend or travel or do certain things with money, but there's always rules. No matter what you do, you're going to be bound by rules. No matter what you want to accomplish, there's going to be a new set of rules. So freedom exists. Freedom is always bounded, and
Hmm,
so accepting that, and so once you voluntarily submit to God's rules, then it's usually easy to navigate lower level rules like governments, financial systems, local laws,
sure. Let me
conventions,
put you on the spot for
customs.
something concrete
If
then.
you if you
Just
want to talk usury, that's a separate debate in terms of, well, what is God's rules? Does God actually forbid usury? Is that God's law or
ah,
not?
yeah, that's what I was going to
This
put as a
dispute
concrete
between
idea.
Muslims and Jews, although even in Judaism it's a dispute. But you say, well, is there this universal set of God's law, or is like, no? I mean, according to my
So I'm
understanding,
going to make a case for anti-usury for everybody, and then we're going to go around because I want something concrete. And I do. The reason why I'm talking about usury and interest because people are generally quite unaware of how dangerous it is. But you might disagree. I would say it's the cause for environmental disasters, as well as war, as well as many other things like making the poor poorer, and so let's call it the wage gap. So three fundamental massive issues caused through interest. I'm not going to go into all the details. We can study it at some point, but let's just say wars are incredibly expensive, billions and billions of dollars, pounds, whatever you. They're never paid for just like that. They're always through money that's borrowed, and you can say with interest, it causes you to something without getting into too much detail. It's called basically your GDP has to keep growing to pay for interest that all governments or Western governments are on. So essentially, the poor and the wage gap is because of the poor have to pay interest and the rich get interest. That's the short version of what. So there's very dangerous things in interest. Islam forbids it. Judaism forbids it, as far as I understand. But Jews, what they say, which is different, is they say God forbade us from doing it to us, our own people, but it didn't say we can't do it to other people. I'm just saying this is a really destructive thing. This would solve most of the problems in the world if we follow the laws of God, is what I'm trying to get at. And interest is just one of those examples. I've made my case. I'll let Claire go because she's had the least to say, and then I'll ask David to say however you'd like to respond, and then we'll kind of wrap up. Go for it, Claire.
I'm not sure what you want.
Okay. So
to summarize.
Yeah, to summarize. But actually, what I was saying is, we've talked about usury or interest as being something.
Well, Islam would allow people to ban usury. We should know from Jews that because Jews are banned from practicing usury on each other, we should know that it's a bad thing. And because Jews are allowed to practice it on Gentile, it suggests that they are being financial predators when they do that. But then they're not forbidden. But we should be able to conclude that the fact that they are forbidden to practice it on each other, but allowed to practice it on us, is a reason for us to forbid it for everyone.
Okay. So cool. And then, David, what's your response for that? And then we'll wind up, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, we could even do like a whole stream just on usury, and I have a whole stream on my channel on usury, and like the history of Judeo-usury and the verses in the Bible. But to say anti-usury is a form of enforced charity, and that's why this other issue, what I call high or low birth in sense of fairness. Why is it that this person has and the other person doesn't? In the sense, why is there a lender and a loanee? Why is it because one person has and the other person doesn't? And usury is, there's also verses, the Quran, the Torah, Moses, about the requirement to lend somebody or the requirement to forgiving loans, but we say it's a form of biblically mandated charity to not charge interest. And from the Judeo perspective, at least, it's disputed in the Talmud among the rabbis about the allowance for usury. Just happens that the majority of Ashkenazic rabbis accepted charging usury to Gentile, but the view would be that this enforced charity only applies to your own and not to others. Have this other
But
question.
just to clarify, it's a really dangerous, destructive system, is what I was arguing, and.
Well, it gets into this question of your view of fairness. We say, well, it's destructive that people take low birth or high birth. It's destructive that some people are born poor and some people are born rich.
It's not just a question of who lends, because in Islam, instead of usury,
you have to have something to lend.
No, but you can lend money as an investment in Islam, where both parties.
But there's a lot of loopholes in Judaism also.
I've
actually taken all the courses from I forget, the Islamic Financial Institute in London on edX about Islamic laws that to some extent basically just replicates the usury system under loopholes in the same way Judaism does for fellow Jews. By saying just this question, we're saying the destructiveness is not being charitable. So usury itself is not destructive, but because in essence it's forced charity. That, I mean, you're saying the natural order of things is you might incur a loss, or you want profit that you lend something. You want if you don't charge interest, you're at a loss situation. At best, you get what you gave back. So the biblical law forbidding usury, if only between fellow Jews, is a mandated charity.
But do you understand the difference between investment and lending on interest? Like,
Well, yeah, I mean,
it's
it's,
not
in most of these laws, like Islamic or Judeo laws, they call heteriska, is just restructuring the same thing in terms of an investment. So, like, you could question whether the current Islamic banking practices are really just a reworking of usurious. Like if you structure a loan as an investment, but so I mean, there is a biblical law that, like, if your enemy comes to you broke, you have to lend to him. Doesn't matter
right.
that like, okay, like, there's a whole bunch of poor Palestinians, and if you have extra, you're required to lend to them. You don't have the right to
Okay.
say, "How are you going to pay me back?" And you're like, well, no, I mean, God, it's an enforced level of charity. And so you say, well, it's dangerous to not be charitable. And then you're
Okay.
talking about that's why you have this complicated issue of rich dad, poor dad, high birth, low birth. How is it that some people don't have assets and other people do? And then the law put to administer some method of fairness. And if it's some method of redistribution of wealth, in the sense that anti-usury laws are a
Hmm.
mechanism of redistribution of wealth.
Okay, so it sounds like we should do probably a whole stream just on this topic of what's the alternative to usury, what are the problems with usury, etc., and what are the religious beliefs on that, etc. So to wind up, um, can we go round, do sort of 1 or 2 minute wind up, last comment? Um, I think Claire's just unmuted or somebody. So Claire, go for it. What if you were to wind up? What would you say for the last 2 minutes for the answer to this question? Are we slave to Jews? You can answer any way you like.
Well, if God exists, then Jews and Gentiles are both the slaves of God. And if Gentiles really believed in God and accepted that Jews are also the slaves of God, they wouldn't be eaten up by the envy that they clearly feel for Jews. And if they really did believe in God, then they might accept their lot and admit their mistakes sooner rather than later to save themselves so much suffering from their idolatry and usury, etc.
Okay, David, your 1 or 2 minute sort of summary of the answer to the questions: Are we slave to Jews? Any way you like.
Yeah, thanks for having this conversation. And yeah, I would say unequivocally no. Even as a proud Jew, no one is a slave to anybody else except in their own mind, unless they, through recognition of the power of God that loves and cares and created a system, nobody is a slave to anybody except in their own mind. There is certain thing of Jews as a managerial class, Jews in relationship to empire and systems and structures and rules, that you could see Jews as one of the administrators over, but you're not actually subservient to the Jews, you're subservient to the rules, and the Jews themselves are not free from the rules. In essence, if the Jews have power, it's because Jews are subservient to God's law and end up as administrators of law and other sources. There's corruption, that Jews could be corrupt, or nepotism, or various things, but that violates God's laws. And if action, reaction, karma eventually comes back to people. God is merciful, slow to judge, but the debt will be collected. So people have to free their own mind from slavery and accept that there's always going to be rules, and that you're actually more free by being in voluntary compliance of rules. And that way, no person is going to be over you. There's just going to be rule sets you have to ascribe to.
Wow. That was so much packed in like 2 minutes, but and I agree with so much of it, and some things we didn't even talk about, like for example, Jews being in a have a historically a managerial role, and I think there's some genetics behind that. So if I was trying to summarize, first of all, I'd agree massively on both of you said, and I'm not just being agreeable. Actually, I thought what I was going to say is going to be very different. That yes, slavery is largely what we are in our minds. I'd say even I know a lot of so-called religious people who are slave to their worries. They're constantly worried that they won't have enough when they're older or something like that. I'd say, um, but I suppose the thing I would say different um, is there are people who want to control us. Could be some rich Jews because there are lots of poor Jews as well, and they have a certain position. I think I don't want to go into it too much, but I think there are differences between the races. For example, black people tend to be more fit. They seem to be doing the best in Olympics, and Jews seem to be very smart. Statistically speaking, they've got a, a massive percentage of the Nobel Prizes in science, for example. So there's something there, and it doesn't mean one person is bad, or it's just people have different benefits. And even in the Quran, it says that we have created sub-tribes and sub-tribes that you may know the good things about each other, so that you can learn from the good qualities of different groups. So without making this answer too long, is that certainly there are people who control and so on, but coming back to my core idea, when we are good, and I agree with somebody commented about decadence of current society that's collapsing and people are taking advantage of it, we have become unrighteous. And the more unrighteous we become, the more we deserve to be ruled, because we make ourselves weak. I think I'll leave it at that. People might not like that, but I'll leave it at that. And I think much more could be said about all of these things. So thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate everybody. It was fantastic having you do it for the first time. Claire, it's always fantastic having you here. And I hope we have many more live streams like this in the future. In fact, we're going to see David again on Thursday, talking about possible solutions. I think there are simple solutions to the Palestinian-Israel conflict. And shalom and bye-bye to you all. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Okay. God bless. Thanks a lot. See you Thursday.
See you.